You're still here? This isn't a shelter.
He was cold. I gave him a cup of coffee.
You gave a stranger our coffee.
She's been doing that her whole life. Giving away what we worked for.
You like what you see? Think she's worth keeping? $50. She's your problem now.
My father said it without flinching. $50, and whatever he believed he owed me simply vanished from his mind. He handed me off the way someone clears a debt fast, satisfied, done. My mother didn't object. She didn't even look up. To both of them, the math was easy. A stranger in worn shoes had just removed their biggest problem. They thought they'd made the smartest deal of their lives. What neither of them could see was that the man in that doorway already knew exactly what $50 would cost them. So why had he really come? If this story is already pulling at something in you, you're not alone. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because where this goes is not where anyone expects. The laundry had a smell I stopped noticing somewhere around year 3. Hot metal, chemical detergent, and the faint sour sweetness of clothes that had been left too long in a drum before anyone got around to drying them. Pike Family Laundry had been sitting on that corner of West Chicago since before I was born, and for most of my adult life, it was the only world I actually lived in. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I was not a child when this happened. I was not someone without options or education or the basic capacity to understand my own situation. I was a grown woman who had convinced herself, year after year, that staying was the right thing to do, because leaving felt like a kind of cruelty I couldn't bring myself to commit. That's the part that took me the longest to admit. When I was 21, I got into a university program I had spent 2 years working toward. I didn't tell my parents right away. I practiced how I would say it, imagined the conversation going a dozen different ways, told myself it would be fine. When I finally told them, my father, Curtis, sat across the dinner table and looked at me the way he always looked at things that inconvenienced him, not angry exactly, but measuring. He said the timing was difficult. He said the shop was struggling. He said he and my mother, Lorraine, weren't getting any younger, and that the books were a mess, and that if I could just stay on for a few months, they'd get things sorted, and then we'd figure out my plans together. A few months. That was the promise. I told myself it was temporary. That's the word I used in my own head, temporary. I would stay a few months, help them stabilize the business, and then go. That word did a lot of damage over a lot of years. The months folded into each other so quietly I barely felt them pass. By the time I understood what had happened, I was the person who opened the shop at 6 in the morning and locked it at 9 at night. I was the one who sorted the incoming loads, flagged missing items before customers could complain, repaired the drum seals on the older machines because hiring someone to fix them cost money we claimed not to have. I did the books. I scheduled the pickups. I handled the customers who came in frustrated about a ruined blouse or a shrunken wool sweater, and I handled them with the kind of patience that gets trained into a person through sheer exhaustion. I did all of this, and I received, most weeks, just enough cash to cover my personal expenses and nothing more. Curtis had a way of framing this that made it nearly impossible to argue with. He would remind me, in the same tired voice, that they had raised me, fed me, kept a roof over my head for more than 20 years. He said that helping your family wasn't something you calculated in hours or dollars, that people who loved each other didn't keep ledgers. He said this with complete sincerity, which was always the strangest part. I don't think he ever once believed he was doing anything wrong. He thought he was teaching me something about loyalty. Lorraine worked differently. She was quieter about it, more careful. When I would bring up leaving, and I did bring it up, maybe 4 or 5 times over those years, she would find the specific thing I felt most guilty about and press on it gently. She would mention that Curtis had been having chest pains and hadn't seen a doctor. She would bring up a customer account that had gone sideways and say she didn't know how they were going to manage it without me. She never raised her voice. She never made threats. She just made it clear, without ever quite saying it, that if I walked out that door, I would be the reason everything fell apart. I stayed each time. I told myself it was love. I told myself it was responsibility. I still don't know exactly what to call it. The night everything changed came in the middle of October, when the rain was the kind that hits the sidewalk sideways and soaks through a jacket in under a minute. We were 20 minutes from closing. I was wiping down the folding counter when I heard the door open and felt the cold air come through before I even turned around. The man who walked in looked like he'd been outside for a long time. His jacket was thin and dark with rain, his boots so worn the sole had separated at the toe on one side. He wasn't old exactly, but he looked like someone life had treated without much consideration. I noticed right away that he was shivering. Curtis noticed too, but what he noticed first was that the man didn't look like he had any money. My father told him the shop was about to close. He said it without particular meanness, just a flat kind of dismissal, the tone he used for things he had already decided weren't worth his attention. I went into the back and brought out the coffee that was left in the pot from that afternoon, still warm, and a clean towel from the stack we used for damaged load refunds. I didn't think about it much. It was raining and the man was cold and the coffee was just sitting there. I set it on the counter in front of him and he thanked me, quietly, and that was all. What I didn't know then was that the security camera mounted above the front counter had been running the entire evening. It was an old system, installed years before I started running the shop, and Curtis had never once mentioned it to me. It captured everything in the front of the shop, the counter, the door, the full length of the register area, and it recorded both video and audio. None of us thought about it that night. None of us thought it mattered. I went back into the sorting room to finish the evening count, and that's when I heard it start. Curtis had lowered his voice, but the shop was small, and the walls didn't do much. He and Lorraine were talking about the accounts, about the loan payment that was past due, and then the conversation shifted, the way those conversations always did eventually, onto me. Curtis said something about how much easier things would be if they didn't have another adult eating out of the same household. Lorraine agreed. She said that if it were just the two of them to worry about, they could tighten up and make it work. They spoke about me the way people speak about a fixed expense, something they hadn't chosen but had ended up responsible for, something that would be easier to remove. I stood in the sorting room and listened, and I felt something in my chest go very still. Then I heard the stranger's voice. Calm. Unhurried. He asked my parents, simply, why they didn't just let me go if they felt that way. Curtis laughed. There was no humor in it. I heard the specific quality of contempt in it, the laugh of someone who believes the person in front of them is beneath the effort of a serious response. He said that if the man liked me so much, he could have me for $50. And then I heard nothing. 10 seconds, maybe 15. And then I heard the soft, flat sound of paper on a counter. When I walked back into the front of the shop, my father was holding a $50 bill folded between two fingers, looking at it with the expression of someone who has just remembered how easy things can be. My small duffel bag, which had been in the storage closet behind the front counter, was sitting beside the door. Lorraine was standing at the far end of the room with her arms folded tight across her chest, her jaw set, not meeting my eyes. Curtis looked at me and said the man had paid and that I was to go with him. I thought it was some kind of punishment. A way to frighten me, to remind me how little standing I had in that house. I looked at Lorraine, waiting for her to say something, to laugh, to tell me it was a joke. She said nothing. I looked at the money in my father's hand, and I understood not all at once, but in the slow, terrible way that real things become real, that he had just accepted payment for me. That my mother had let him. That they had done it in less time than it takes to finish a cup of cold coffee. I picked up the bag. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I trusted myself to say. Outside, the rain was still coming down hard. The stranger walked beside me without speaking for nearly a block, and I stayed because I had nowhere else to go and because something in his stillness made him feel less dangerous than the building I had just left. When we reached the corner under a working streetlight, I stopped walking. I asked him what he expected from me. I needed to know the shape of what I had walked into. He reached into his jacket and took out the piece of paper my father had written on the one Curtis had slid across the counter like a receipt. The man looked at it for a moment, then tore it in half and let the pieces fall. He said I didn't belong to him. He said he had only wanted to see whether my parents would actually do it. I asked him what he was talking about. He said he had heard enough of what they were saying in that back room to want to know if they meant it, if they would really trade me for cash. The way you sell something, you no longer want cluttering up the space. He said now he knew. He told me his name was Adrian. He said there was a small apartment above a theater nearby, a building that was being renovated and currently empty. He said I could stay there for the night. He said if I wanted to leave in the morning, no one would stop me. He took a key from his jacket pocket and held it out. It was such a simple thing. A key. A door. A choice with no strings visibly attached. I had been given choices for years that came wrapped in guilt and obligation, and the implication that the wrong answer would cause suffering I'd be blamed for. I stood in the rain and looked at that key and tried to find the catch. I couldn't locate one. I thought about going back. The logic was there if I looked for it. They were still my parents. It was still a roof. I still knew how the machines worked and where the accounts were kept and what the morning routine looked like. Going back was, in one sense, the rational choice. It was the path I could predict. But I had heard my father's voice when he held up that bill. I had seen the way my mother chose her own composure over my face. And I understood, standing in the rain with a stranger's key in my hand, that going back wouldn't change what I now knew. It would just mean pretending I didn't know it. I took the key. Adrian walked me to the building, showed me which door it opened, and said very little else. He didn't ask me questions or explain himself further. He didn't try to make the moment into something it wasn't. He just made sure I was inside and out of the rain, and then he left. I sat on the floor of that empty apartment for a long time that night, listening to the rain hit the windows. I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about all the years I had spent believing that staying was the loving thing, that the guilt I felt every time I thought about leaving meant I was a good person. I thought about what my mother's silence had actually cost me. I thought about the $50, flat in my father's hand, and how fast he'd taken it. I didn't know anything about the man who had just handed me a key. I didn't know where he came from, or what he did, or why he'd been standing in a rain-soaked jacket in my parents' laundry shop 20 minutes before closing. I knew only that he had offered me a door without a price attached to it. For the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, I had made a choice that belonged entirely to me. I wasn't going back. The first few weeks in that apartment were the strangest of my life, and not for the reasons I would have expected. I had food. I had a door that locked from the inside. I had a bed, a small one, that someone had left behind when the theater renovation cleared out the upper floor. By any practical measure, my situation had improved. And yet I spent most of those early mornings sitting on the windowsill, watching the street below and waiting for the other shoe to drop, because that was the only pattern I had ever been taught. Kindness, in my experience, always came attached to something. A favor owed. An expectation quietly accumulating interest. I had never once received help from someone who didn't eventually present a bill. Adrian didn't present a bill. He came by every few days, not every day, which I noticed. He brought groceries once without making a ceremony of it, just left a paper bag on the kitchen counter and didn't mention it again. He didn't ask me what I was doing with my time or suggest I should be doing something different. He didn't ask about my parents or push me to talk about what had happened that night in the laundry. He treated me like someone who had the right to move at her own pace, and I didn't know how to receive that without suspicion. I found work within the second week. A small bakery about 6 blocks away was looking for someone to handle the morning prep and front counter, starting before dawn and finishing by early afternoon. The pay wasn't substantial, but it was real, and it was mine. When I told Adrian, he said that was good and asked if I had a bank account in my own name. I didn't. For years, any money I'd earned had gone through the shop accounts, which were in my parents' names. He told me the nearest branch, mentioned I'd need 2 forms of ID, and left it at that. He didn't offer to come with me or handle it for me. He just told me the information and trusted me to do the rest. The day I opened that account and deposited my first paycheck, $212, I stood at the ATM afterward and read my name on the receipt 3 times. Mara Pike. Account holder. It sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. I had been earning money for years inside that shop and had never once had a number attached to my name in a place that was only mine. Over the weeks that followed, I started to notice things about Adrian that didn't line up. The worn jacket and the old boots were consistent. He dressed the same way every time I saw him. Nothing expensive, nothing that suggested anything beyond someone getting by. But the way he spoke about certain things didn't match that image at all. One evening, I brought home an employment contract from the bakery. A standard document the owner had asked me to sign, and Adrian glanced at it while I was making coffee. Within a few minutes, he had identified 3 clauses I should push back on: specific language around unpaid trial hours, an arbitration clause that waived certain rights, and a non-compete provision that was broader than anything a bakery position could reasonably justify. He explained each one clearly and without condescension, the way a person explains something they've understood for so long it no longer requires effort. I asked him how he knew that. He said he'd read a lot of contracts. I let it go, but I filed it. Another time, we were walking back from a supply run and passed a commercial construction site, a few blocks from the apartment, a large development, cranes up, the whole block fenced off. Adrian looked at it as we passed and said, almost to himself, that the east drainage plan was going to cause problems when the ground thawed in spring, that whoever had approved the foundation layout hadn't accounted for the water table correctly. He said it the way someone says the weather looks like rain. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't even really talking to me. He was just thinking out loud about something he apparently understood in considerable depth. I started watching more carefully after that, and I noticed that sometimes, when we were out in the city, men in business clothes would see Adrian from a distance, and something would happen in their posture. A straightening. A small instinctive adjustment, the kind of thing a person does when they recognize someone with authority before their conscious mind has fully processed it. Adrian would change direction, or find something to look at, or simply move us along faster. He never acknowledged it. One afternoon, I asked him directly. I said I wanted to know who he actually was. He looked at me for a moment, and then said he was someone trying to find out who was worth trusting. I told him that wasn't an answer. He said it was the only one he had right now. I didn't push further, but I didn't forget the question either. The answer came on a Tuesday morning, and it didn't come gently. Adrian received a call just after 8. I was in the kitchen, and I heard the change in his voice before I heard any words. That particular shift a person's tone makes when something they've been managing at a distance has suddenly become urgent. He came to the doorway and said there was a situation he had to deal with, that he needed to go. I asked if everything was all right. He said he wasn't sure yet, and then he left. I didn't hear from him that day. The next morning, nothing. By the second afternoon, I was feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not just concern, but the specific anxiety of someone who has only just begun to believe that a good thing is real and is now afraid it will turn out not to have been. I went through the apartment looking for something, anything, that might tell me how to reach him or whether I should be worried. In the kitchen drawer, under a takeout menu and a spare set of batteries, I found a business card. Small, white. Just an address printed on it and a name I didn't recognize. The address was in the Loop, the central business district. I had no reason to assume it was connected to Adrian, but I had no other lead, and the address was only 20 minutes away, so I went. I came out of the subway at Washington and started walking east, checking the address on the card. The building I was looking for should have been in the middle of the next block. What I found instead was a tower, glass and steel, rising far above the surrounding buildings, with the kind of presence that makes you aware of it before you've fully turned the corner. The name was etched into the stone base in letters large enough to read from across the street. Vale Meridian Tower. The lobby was enormous and cold and full of people moving with the particular efficiency of a place that doesn't slow down. I walked to the reception desk and said I was looking for a man named Adrian. The person behind the counter asked for a last name. I said I wasn't certain. She looked at me for a moment, then said, very carefully, "Are you looking for Mr. Vale?" Before I could answer, I heard the sound of multiple car doors opening outside. Through the lobby's glass front, I saw a line of black vehicles at the curb, and then the organized movement of people arranging themselves assistants, what looked like senior staff, a security presence at the periphery. The front doors opened. Adrian walked in. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, moving with a certainty I had never seen in him before, because I had never seen him in a context that required it. The lobby rearranged itself around him. People who had been walking stopped. People behind desks straightened in their chairs. Someone near the elevators said it clearly enough that I heard it from the reception desk. "Good morning, Mr. Vale." I turned around and looked at the wall behind the desk. There was a large mounted display: company history, leadership, founding date. And there, beside a photograph I recognized as a younger version of the man I had just watched walk through that lobby, was the text that made everything rearrange in my mind. Adrian Vale, founder and executive chairman, Vale Meridian Group. I stood there long enough that a security guard came over to ask if I needed assistance. I said no. I wasn't sure that was true. Adrian saw me before I reached him. Something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, but a recognition that this moment had arrived sooner than he had perhaps planned for. He told his team he needed a few minutes and led me to a side room off the main lobby, a small conference space with a glass wall and a round table. I sat across from him and didn't say anything right away, because I was still working out what I actually wanted to say. He explained it without me asking. For several months before that October night, Vale Meridian had been receiving internal reports that something was wrong inside its own system, workers being pushed past legal hour limits in facilities the company owned, low-income tenants in company-managed buildings being denied maintenance they were owed, money going missing in ways that were covered up before it reached anyone with authority to act on it. Every time Adrian visited a site as himself, everything was in order. The problems had been smoothed over before he arrived. He couldn't see what was actually happening because everyone who had something to hide knew enough to hide it from the chairman. So he stopped being the chairman, temporarily and privately. He dressed differently, moved differently, stayed in parts of the city where his company operated and where no one would recognize him. He wanted to know how people behaved when they thought he was nobody, when there was no advantage to be gained from treating him well. That was how he had ended up standing in the rain outside Pike Family Laundry 20 minutes before closing on a Tuesday night in October. I listened to all of this. Then I told him I understood the logic. I said I could see why he'd done it and I wasn't arguing with his reasons. And then I told him that what he had done to me, specifically, was its own problem. That he had let me trust him without giving me the information I needed to decide whether that trust was reasonable. That keeping secrets from someone while they were learning to let their guard down was a form of control, even if it was gentler than the kind I was used to. He didn't argue with me. He didn't explain further or add qualifications. He said I was right. He said he had been so focused on what he was trying to find out that he hadn't thought carefully enough about what it meant to bring someone else into his life while he was living under false pretenses. He said he was sorry plainly, without softening it into something easier to give. And I believed him. That was the complicated part. I believed that he meant it, and I also needed time to sit with the fact that the first person who had made me feel safe in years had still, in one significant way, not been fully honest with me. Those two things were both true at the same time, and I wasn't ready to collapse them into a single feeling. I told him I needed some space to think. I left the building and walked back toward the apartment, and I did not reach out to him that night. I spent 2 days on my own, going to work, coming back, sitting with the question of what I actually wanted. I kept returning to one specific thing the moment in that small conference room when I told him he'd been wrong, and he didn't try to talk me out of it. I had spent years in a house where no one ever responded that way, where every mistake I named was redirected into a reason why I was the one being unfair. The fact that Adrian could hear what I was telling him and simply say he was sorry didn't resolve everything, but it told me something real about who he was. I was still sitting with all of that when everything broke open in a completely different direction. It started with a news alert I saw on a phone screen at the bakery. A customer had left it face up on the counter while she sorted through her bag. I caught 3 words in the headline before she picked it up, and I couldn't read the rest. But 3 words were enough to make my stomach drop. My name, the company name, and $50. By the time I got back to the apartment that evening, the story was everywhere. Curtis and Lorraine had seen something in the news that connected me to Vale, Meridian, and they had understood immediately what they had given away the night they stood in that laundry shop, and said nothing while a stranger handed over cash. They had gone to a lawyer first. I learned this later, and the lawyer had contacted the company on their behalf. Adrian had refused whatever they were asking for. So they had gone to the media instead. And what they told the media bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. The headline that ran that first evening was precise in its damage. A powerful man, a vulnerable family in financial distress, $50 changing hands. The story my parents told framed Curtis as a father, pushed to desperation, and Adrian as someone who had exploited that desperation. Lorraine appeared on camera, composed and tearful in the way that reads, on a screen, as genuine suffering. Curtis described himself as a man who had made a mistake in a moment of crisis and was now fighting to protect his daughter. They had turned the truth completely inside out, and they had done it in front of a city that was already inclined to distrust wealth. By the next morning, people were calling me by a name I hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. The $50 girl. It followed me on every platform, in every comment section, in the way people at the bakery looked at me when they thought I wasn't watching. My parents had sold me once for $50. Now they were selling the story of it for something much larger, and they were using my face to do it. I had left that house to stop being a resource they could draw from. It turned out I hadn't gone far enough. Adrian called me the morning after the story broke. He didn't open with an apology or an explanation. He asked if I was all right. I told him I wasn't sure yet. He said he understood, and then he told me what had happened on his end, that Curtis had contacted Vale Meridian's legal team first, that the number Curtis had asked for was significant enough to confirm this had never been about protecting anyone, and that when Adrian refused, the media became the next available lever. He said his legal team was prepared to respond, that he had documentation, and that he could have this managed within a week if I was willing to let him handle it. I told him to wait. He didn't argue. He said he'd give me whatever time I needed, but that the board was beginning to ask questions, and the longer the story ran unchallenged, the more damage it would do to people inside the company who had nothing to do with any of this. I heard what he was saying. I also heard something underneath it, that he was genuinely asking me, not instructing me, not deciding for me. He was holding the door open and waiting to see if I'd walk through it on my own terms. I thought about it for most of that day. I went to work because I needed somewhere to be that wasn't the apartment, and I made pastry dough and portioned bread loaves and wiped down the display case and let the routine hold me while I worked through what I actually wanted to do. The name was still circulating. I saw it twice before noon, once on someone's phone screen and once on a television in the corner of a cafe where I picked up lunch. The $50 girl. Each time I saw it, I felt something shift slightly inside me, not further down, but sideways, into something harder and more deliberate. The thing I kept returning to was this. My parents had told a story about me without asking me. They had decided what my experience meant, packaged it in a way that served them, and distributed it to anyone willing to pay attention. They had done this before, in smaller ways. For years, every time Curtis explained to a customer why I was handling a difficult situation, every time Lorraine told someone outside the family about my shortcomings. The media story was just the largest version of a habit they had never once questioned. I could let Adrian's lawyers respond on my behalf. That would work. The problem would be handled, and I would have successfully allowed one more person to speak for me because it was easier than speaking for myself. I had been doing that my whole life, and I was tired of it in a way that had finally reached the bottom of me. I called Adrian back that evening and told him I wanted to appear at the board hearing myself. I told him I wasn't going to sit behind his legal team or issue a statement through a publicist. I was going to be in the room, and I was going to say what had actually happened, in my own words, and whatever followed from that would follow. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he said if that was what I wanted, he would make sure I had the opportunity. Curtis and Lorraine arrived at the hearing with a lawyer of their own, which I had expected. They came in looking the way they always looked when they were performing for an audience, composed, concerned, slightly wounded. My father had on a jacket I hadn't seen in years. My mother's expression was the carefully arranged kind she used when she wanted people to understand she had endured a great deal quietly. I had watched that expression my whole childhood. I knew every detail of it. I sat beside Adrian at the table, not behind him. That part mattered to me. Curtis opened with the same version of the story he had given the media. He said it with conviction. He had probably repeated it enough times by then that he had started to believe it himself. When he finished, I looked at him directly and asked him a single question. If he genuinely believed someone had purchased me, I wanted to understand why he had accepted the money. He started to answer, and then didn't. He reset and tried again, and the second attempt was no better than the first. The lawyer beside him put a hand briefly on his arm, which I think was meant to slow him down, but it was already too late. The room had registered what his silence meant. Vale Meridian's legal counsel then presented the evidence. The security camera that had been running above the front counter at Pike Family Laundry that October night had captured everything the full width of the front of the shop, audio included. The footage was played on a screen at the front of the room without commentary, and every person present heard my father's voice offer to hand me over for $50. They heard my mother say she just wanted me out of the house. And they heard, after I had already left and the door had closed behind me, Curtis lift the bill and say it was the easiest $50 he had ever made. He had said it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just solved a problem efficiently. He hadn't known the camera was running. It hadn't occurred to him that it mattered. After the footage, the legal team presented the record of communications Curtis had sent to Vale Meridian in the days following the initial news story, the demand for a specific sum in exchange for silence, the follow-up messages when no one responded, the shift in tone when it became clear the company wouldn't pay. The document trail made the sequence of events unmistakable. My parents had not come forward out of concern for me. They had come forward because they saw an asset, the story of what they had done, and they tried to sell it, the same way they had tried to sell everything else. The room was very quiet when the presentation finished. I looked at the board members, and then at the press seated along the side wall, and then I turned and looked at my parents. Curtis was staring at the table. Lorraine had her chin lifted, her expression locked into something that was trying to hold its shape and failing at the edges. I hadn't planned every word I was going to say. I had decided to let it come from wherever it needed to come from. I told them that for a long time I had believed their version of me, that I owed them something unpayable, that leaving would make me selfish, that my value as a person was connected to how useful I was to their household. I said I had stayed years longer than I should have because I was afraid of what it would mean about me if I walked away. And then I said the thing I had been carrying since the night I stood in the rain with a stranger's key in my hand. I said that they had sold me for $50 because they thought that was all I was worth. But that number had never been about me. It was a measure of what they were willing to accept in exchange for getting rid of a problem they had created by treating their daughter like one. $50 wasn't my price. It was the cost of my exit from a life I should have left much sooner, and I was grateful for it. Neither of them said anything that mattered after that. The legal outcome moved quickly. The board cleared Adrian of any wrongdoing. The partner companies that had suspended activity reinstated their agreements within the following week. The story that had called me the $50 girl was followed, within days, by a different story, one that was harder to reduce to a headline because it required people to sit with something uncomfortable. That two parents had not only handed their daughter over for cash, but had then tried to profit from having done it. My parents asked to meet with me privately a few weeks after the hearing. We sat in a coffee shop far from the old neighborhood. No lawyers and no cameras. Lorraine told me that whatever had happened, we were still family, that family found ways to come back to each other. She said it in the soft, careful voice she used when she was trying to lead someone toward the conclusion she had already decided on. I recognized it immediately. I had grown up fluent in it. I told her that family was not a word that automatically covered every action taken by people who shared blood. That the word described a particular quality of relationship, not just a biological fact. And that what she and Curtis had done both on the night itself and in the weeks that followed was not something the word family was large enough to excuse. I finished my coffee and left, and I did not look back when I walked out the door. The months that followed were the first in my adult life that felt genuinely like mine. I enrolled in the program I had deferred nearly a decade earlier, worked through the returning student process, and attended evening and weekend classes while keeping my mornings at the bakery. I lived carefully on what I earned and didn't ask Adrian for anything I hadn't decided I actually needed. He offered me a position at Vale Meridian when the hearing concluded. I said no. He asked why, and I told him the truth that if I walked into that building as anything other than someone who had gotten there on her own, I would spend the rest of my time there wondering whether I had earned it or whether I was simply another problem he had found a way to manage. He thought about that for a while and said he understood. He said the offer would remain open. I told him I appreciated that, and I meant it, and I knew I wasn't going to change my mind. What I did accept was an introduction through Vale Meridian's Community Partnerships Division to an organization that worked with women navigating the specific kind of financial trap I had spent years inside. Women being pressured to work without fair compensation inside family structures that used obligation as currency. Women who didn't know what their rights were because no one had ever told them they had any. I began volunteering there on weekends, and eventually, after I completed my degree, I moved into a staff role that drew on everything I had learned about reading contracts and understanding what leverage looks like from the inside. Adrian and I rebuilt what was between us slowly and without forcing it into a shape it wasn't ready for. The terms were different this time. No secrets, no information asymmetry, no version of events being managed by one person for the other's benefit. We were two people who had seen each other clearly under difficult circumstances and decided, independently and then together, that what they saw was worth continuing toward. We got married on a Saturday in early spring, in a room with large windows and no grand production, because neither of us wanted grand production. What we wanted was something true. A few months after the wedding, I found myself on the street where I had grown up, and I came around the corner and saw the old shop. The sign was still there. The hours posted in the window were outdated, the place had closed sometime in the year following the hearing, and no one had thought to take the sign down. The lights were off. The machines inside were still. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment. I thought about the smell of that place, the weight of the morning shift, the specific exhaustion of being needed constantly in a way that has nothing to do with being valued. I thought about what it had cost me to stay as long as I had, and what it had cost me to finally leave. Both things were real, and I wasn't going to pretend the years hadn't happened or that they hadn't made me who I am. But I also wasn't going to stand there and grieve them any longer. Across the street, Adrian was waiting. No security, no entourage, just him with his jacket collar up against the wind, watching me with the patience of someone who has learned not to rush a person through a moment they need to finish on their own terms. I crossed the street and took his hand, and we walked, and behind us the sign above the dark window of Pike Family Laundry held its ground against the wind for a little while longer. I didn't look back. If Mara's story stayed with you, I think it's because somewhere in it is something most of us already know but rarely say out loud, that the people who are supposed to love us are not always the ones who treat us like we matter, and that walking away from that is not abandonment. It is the beginning of something that actually belongs to you. If that's a truth you needed to hear today, share this with someone who needs it too. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. We'll be here every time you need a reminder that your worth was never theirs to set.